Welcome back to the book of Genesis. We're looking at Genesis chapter 12, 1 to 4. Probably one of the most important passages in the Old Testament. It begins with the looking forward to the new people of God being promoted, the new Israel, and then ultimately the promises not only for their time but also for us today. We're included in the seed promise. So Abraham is a super important person in both the Jewish, Arabic or Islam as well as Christian religion. And he's named to be the father of all three major religions. Remember, we're talking about the scriptures being a library of 66 books, so we're looking at obviously the first book in that library. The promise to Abram. One of the much of the dating in the earlier part of the Bible are what we need to recognize as man's estimates, because God didn't give us the dates. So when new archaeological discoveries are found that more accurately date the time and the place, then we're happy for that. We ought not to blame the Bible for getting it wrong, but rather we humans who like to have everything packaged in neat little boxes, we really are at fault. In the last 100 years, many of the Egyptian cities and artifacts have had to be redated. According to latest satellite images, there's at least 148 cities that have not even been started to be investigated. So we're going to have lots of fun with that. So the city of Ebla is located in present-day Syria. The city was discovered in the remains of Tel Mardich. Among the findings discovered was the city's archive, located in the palace. The city archive discoveries seem to now show that the life of Abraham could be concurrent with the early dynasty periods in Mesopotamia, the early dynastic and old kingdoms in Egypt, and the Ebla Empire in Syria. The evidence related to Genesis 14 and Sodom and Gomorrah also supports a conclusion that Abraham lived during the early Bronze Age, early dynastic period. Hammurabi, king of Babylon, on the left, facing the god Shamash. This is the sun god, the god of justice. Promises to Abraham, we see then the dating evidence is also subject to change, depending on more new discoveries, so we should not be dogmatic in some of our statements of dates at this early period in time. All agree that Abraham, later named Abraham, was born after the flood. Many historians in time past thought he was born between 2200 and 2100 BC, in the days of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, because he identified Hammurabi with the king Amraphel, mentioned in Genesis 14. This means that he is usually dated in the Middle Bronze Age, which was the Mesopotamian equivalent to the Ur III and Isin Larsa periods. However, with the chronology of the ancient world coming under scrutiny, it's only natural that the historical background of Abraham also may be redated. Studies in ancient chronology now show that the life of Abraham was concurrent with the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia, the early dynastic and old kingdoms in Egypt, and the Ebla Empire in Syria. Understanding Abraham lived during the early Bronze Age and early dynastic period allows us to understand more clearly the cultural background of the Genesis narratives. But even these dates may be subject to change as archaeologists continue to dig up new evidence. Much of the dating game is still guesswork as we try to fit together pieces of the puzzle of the past. None of man's speculation about dates changes the accuracy of what God has revealed. Abram and Isaac entered Bible history after the flood. During those intervening years, Noah, descendants, lost faith in God and deified him and defied him in attempting to build the Tower of Babel. After God scattered the people, the population kept expanding. With the increase in the earth's population came also an increase in sin again. Throughout the first part of the book of Genesis, there's a pattern seen concerning the judgments of God. After God pronounced the judgment upon sin, he follows that judgment by offering a way of escape and salvation from that judgment. We look, for example, at Adam and Eve cast out of the Garden of Eden, and yet there's a promise of redemption through the seed of the woman. Cain is banished from the presence of God for murdering his brother, but God placed a mark on Cain so no one will take a vengeance upon him. Flood brought about upon the earth. 8 souls are saved in the ark. A confusion of languages and nations dispersed. And yet Abram is to be a blessing to the nations. The early chapter of Genesis tells us of the creation of mankind and his placement into a garden. But then came the fall and man was cast out of the garden. When God cast Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he also gave them the first promise of redemption through the seed of the woman. When God banished Cain for his presence after he had murdered Abel, he set a mark upon Cain to protect him from anyone who might be seeking vengeance. When the Lord brought a flood upon the earth to destroy all life, he allowed 8 people to be saved within the ark. When God confused the language of Tower of Babel, he doomed the world to an existence of misunderstanding, strife and confusion. We have seen the account of this judgment in chapter 11. And now, at the end of chapter 11, we have the introduction to one particular individual whom God chooses to bless. His name is Abram. It will be through Abram that all the nations in the world will ultimately be blessed, just as they had previously been judged. Where man had been driven away, now one particular man would be brought back into a special land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that should be likened to a garden. Where man had once been told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, now we read of a promise given to one man that he would be a great nation, that he would be a blessing to others. Where the earth had once been cursed on man's behalf, now we read that through this one man all of the families of the earth will ultimately be blessed. So, the background to Abraham, this is the account of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor and Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldees, in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarah was barren. She had no children. In Genesis 11:27, this is the account of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor and Haran. Haran became the father of Lot. Haran never had a wife who gave birth to Lot, but she is not mentioned. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abraham's wife, Sarah, and the name of Nahor's Milcah, daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Here we are introduced to the wives of Abraham and Nahor. Of the two, it will be Sarah who shall play a key role in the family narrative. Note there's no injunction against marrying one's niece. Even the law prohibited the marrying one's sister was not yet in effect. These things didn't come into effect until the time of Moses. So we see him travelling up from Sumer to Padan. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram. Together they set out from Ur of the Chaldees to go to Canaan, but when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. We're not told how old Abraham was when he and his family left Ur of the Chaldees, but in Genesis 12:4 we find that he was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. This would have taken place in the year approximately 2085 BC or 2735 BC, and the date of Abram's birth would be placed at 2160 or 2810 by new calculation dates. This would mean Abram departed from Ur of the Chaldees at a time when it was at its zenith. This begins another section of the book of Genesis. We've already seen the generations of the heavens and the earth, the generations of Adam, the generations of Noah, the generations of Shem. In each case, this introductory phrase has gone on to tell about the descendants of the one who was named. The name Terah is used of no one else in the Bible. The origins and meaning of his name are unknown. And Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldees. The family of Terah was beset by an untimely tragedy in the death of Haran. We're not told the details of his death, but he left his son Lot fatherless. It would be Abram who would act as a guardian for this young man. Sir C. Leonard Woolley spent 12 years excavating the city of Ur, located in southern Mesopotamia. Since that time, most scholars have felt that this was the city of Abraham's birth. Woolley found an ancient metropolis with a population of 34,000 in the inner district and as much as 250,000 in the outlying districts. Ur was the scene of a great war and great culture during the days when Abram lived. For a time, the king of this city was the supreme monarch over all the cities of southern Mesopotamia, restoring Sumer to the glory it had held in the days of Sargon the Great, 300 years earlier. Ur contained a number of schools where students were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. They learned to write in Sumerian cuneiform, pressing their wedge-shaped markers into lumps of soft clay. The religion of Ur involved the entire pantheon of Sumer. The city itself was home to the patron god Nana, the moon god. Abram and his family originally participated in this pagan worship. From ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abram, and the father of Nahor. They served other gods, Joshua said. Even the name Abraham reflects his pagan origins. It means exalted father or father of the high places. It is a possible reference to regular worship atop the ziggurat of Ur. This was a period of the golden age of Ur. It would be the case 100 years later, not be the case 100 years later, but now Ur was the key city in Mesopotamia. It was in the midst of great economic prosperity that Yahweh would have revealed himself to Abraham and commanded him to leave his home in Ur and travel to a faraway land. Abram was not called out of a country that was on the verge of destruction, but from one that was at the very peak of prosperity. A northern location for Ur, several problems arise in identification of Leonard Woolley's Ur as the city of Abram's birthplace. Therefore, some have speculated on the existence of another city by the name of Ur located in northern Mesopotamia. Southern Ur was not associated with the Chaldeans until the 10th century BC. It's possible the mention of the Chaldeans in our Genesis text is a scribal insertion to assist us in determining the location of Ur. It would be like us speaking of the ancient Mayans of Mexico. The Septuagint reading of Genesis doesn't say that Abram came from Ur. Instead, they went out together from Ur of the Chaldees. The Greek reads, led them out of the land of the Chaldeans. When Abram was going to send for a wife for his son Isaac, he gave his servant the following instructions. You must go to my country, to my relatives, and take a wife for my son Isaac. The phrase translated my country refers to my land. This is not just the people of Abraham. This was also his land. Where did the servant go? He went to Haran. There continues to be a city in what is today Western Turkey known as Urfa. It is located very close to Haran, and the local traditions of this city designated as the birthplace of Abram. In support of this, Gary Rensburg points out that if you were to go from Ur in southern Iraq to Canaan, you'd never go through Haran. It's simply not on the way. But if you begin in this northern Ur, you would indeed go through Haran on your way to Canaan. On the other hand, if the phrase Ur of the Chaldees were reflective of a later insertion, it would identify the southern location of the city. If this reference is a scribal insertion from a later period, at least it informs us that a scribe intended us to consider this to be the city that was excavated by Woolley. Does it really matter whether Abram came from the southern city or the better known northern city or the better known southern city? Not really. People travelled through the ancient world of that day, and cultural habits were regularly imported from faraway places. As we come to the 12th chapter of Genesis, there's a sudden and dramatic change to the character of the book. We have already noted the literary style of Moses. He always deals first with the overview, stating it in brief and concise terms. Then he returns to that part of the narrative which is central to his main theme to cover it at length. Moses does the same here. The first 11 chapters have gone through primeval history of man at breakneck speed. Now the pace slows down as we take a more careful look at the history of the patriarchs and of the covenant. So Genesis 1 to 11 events are central. Creation, fall, flood, Tower of Babel takes place over a period of more than 2,000 years, and the human race as a whole. Genesis 12 to 50, people are central. Abram, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph takes place over a period of about 250 years, dealing mainly with the family or descendants of Abraham. Thus the main emphasis of Genesis is on people, and this ought to be our emphasis in ministry as well. So the call of Abram or Abraham, as we study the narrative accounts of the first three patriarchs, Abram, Isaac and Jacob, as similar in pattern these accounts will emerge. Each is given a series of promises by God, which includes the following: a seed, a land, a blessing, and blessing to the nations. Each live as aliens in the land of Canaan, wandering among the inhabitants of the land. Each had wives who experienced barrenness before giving birth to the promised sons. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah all end up in that situation. Each had a dual rivalry among his sons. Abram, or as he's later called Abraham, is seen in history as the father of both the Jews and the Arab nations. Judaism, Christianity and Islam hold him up as a spiritual leader. This means that a study of the life of Abraham will be important to our understanding not only of the major religions of the world but also to Western culture. Let's talk about Father Abram. The promises are to Abraham, Ishmael, sons of flesh, Isaac, son of promise, and man of faith, Genesis 22. During this confused and sinful time, God chose Abraham, who, like Noah centuries before, stood above his generation because he wanted to please God, or at least a God, but he wanted to please God. Because of his unquestioning faith, Abraham loved and obeyed God as he come to know him. Then the Lord told Abraham, leave your country, your relatives, your father's house, go to the land that I will show you. God promised that through Abraham's descendants, Jesus himself would be born, the Messiah. Abraham obeyed God because of his unquestioning faith. There are many titles that we could struggle to bear as humans because of their magnitude and responsibility. For example, the father of the faith, the man according to God's heart, the friend of God, the preacher of righteousness, the humblest man on earth. Abram is in the sacred records not for being Superman, but for being obedient to God, Romans 4:3. Abram's family line is found in Genesis 11:10 to 26. Abraham's past is dealt with in 27 to 32. Genesis 12 to 14 is his call and removal to Canaan, initiation of the covenant, the separation of the covenant. Genesis 15 to 16, the promise of a direct heir and ratification of the covenant. Genesis 17 to 21, establishment of the covenant, the circumcision, change of name to Abraham, institution of the covenant and the testing of the covenant. Genesis 22 to 25, the testing of Abraham to offer Isaac, and also then the death of Abraham. Abraham in New Testament, the teaching of Jesus is found in Acts 7, it's found in Romans 4, Galatians 3 and 4, Hebrews 7 and 11 and James 2. He left Haran, Ishmael born, Isaac, Sarah dies, and then the death, 175. Abram was chosen and called by God. God made a promise to Abram. Although God's call to Abram to leave his country and family to go to the land of Canaan is not recounted in the 11th chapter, we know from Acts 7, 2 to 4 that God had spoken to Abram while still in his birth city of Ur of Chaldee and told him to go to a land that God would show him. These are some of the other, it's interesting in the Bible where we're mainly dealing with the main story, and the main story revolves around Abraham. We hardly hear mentioned much of the Hittite Empire, the Mitanni, the Syrian and the Babylonian. It's interesting also that the Hittites were named in the Bible, and up until about 1910, 1920, they were deemed as a mistake of the Bible. The archaeologists and historians and the anti-God people all said the Hittites never existed, and yet in the early 1900s they dug them up. The Bible was vindicated. This area of northern Mesopotamia is where the original Chaldeans are said to have come from. Xenophon, writing 1,000 years after Moses, states that the Chaldeans lived close to the Armenians. An examination of the Nuzu tablets indicates that the patriarchs reflect more of a northern Mesopotamian culture than of the Sumerians. The fact the author goes out of his way to designate the city as Ur of the Chaldees suggests it was not that familiar a city to the original readers of Genesis. Obviously they've come out of Egypt. They have been in that area for quite some time, and they haven't really got a lot of contact with their history. And Moses is taking the time to help them to understand who they are and where they come from, what their generation roots are. And that's why it goes back to the situation here with God's help. Rensburg points this out by way of analogy. He says, let's use analogy. London, the great city of London, England, or London, Ontario. Which London were we talking about? If I just said London, you would correctly think I was referring to London, England, because you are in London, England, most of you. If I'd refer to a second London, I have to add another term, and indeed I would say London, Ontario, so you know that it's talking about the Canadian London. That's why the Bible, to my mind, says Ur of the Chaldees, because if you just said Ur, people would know you're talking about the Great Ur. Would not know if you're talking about the Great Ur, or the one, or the people would know that you're talking about the Great Ur, the one in the south, not the one in the north. In Acts 7, when Stephen stood before the high priest in Jerusalem, he stated that God had first appeared to Abram while he was in Ur before moving to Haran. Haran was at the crossroads of the main highways from Mesopotamia to the west. Indeed, the name Haran actually means crossroads. Located on the Bilka River, 60 miles north of where it empties into the Euphrates, the city sits at the crossroads of 3 different continents. It's a central hub with spokes leading out to Europe, Asia, and Africa. Abram was told to leave his country as well as his relatives. The Genesis account of Abram's departure tells us that Abram was accompanied by his father and his brothers. Was this a corporate move in disobedience to the command to leave his relatives? Perhaps not. It is possible this part of the command was not made known to Abram until after he had come to Haran. We've already mentioned that Abram was an idol worshipper before leaving Ur. There's no indication that Abram's family ever stopped worshipping these pagan gods. In the case of Laban, the nephew of Abram and the uncle of Jacob, the most that we can say is that he considered Yahweh to be one of many tribal gods. Only in Abram do we find a man who worshipped Yahweh exclusively. It is here in chapter 12 that we read of the Lord's call to Abram. Yet already we see both Abraham and his father and family relocating from the original home of Ur of the Chaldees to the city of Haran. Furthermore, we're told that this was done in order to enter the land of Canaan. This sort of migration was not unknown in the ancient world. There were not only families but entire people groups that were known to have migrated during this period. Yet the migration of Abraham's family had a particular designation. It was in order to enter the land of Canaan. I do not think this necessarily means they knew that Canaan was their final destination. The writer of Hebrews tells us that Abram, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. There's an interesting lesson here. It's a lesson of destination. Being unaware of your final destination doesn't prevent you from getting there. The reason that Abram made it to the promised land was not because of his good planning. It was because he acted by the obedience of faith, and the Lord brought him there. The call of Abraham. Having left all the Chaldees and come to Haran, but more is required. He is called to leave his country and his relatives. They will remain in Haran, and he must travel to another land. Genesis 12:1-5 talks about the nation. I will make you a great nation. And remember, he doesn't have any children this time. a seed. In your families all the earth shall be blessed. Remember, he doesn't have any children this time. A land to your descendants I will give this land. He hasn't got any. This is a sovereign call. God didn't call Abraham on the basis of some merit on the part of Abraham. It was not a matter of Abraham initiating the call. It was God who began this process. It was a gracious call. Abraham was to receive abundant blessings that he didn't deserve, which he had not earned. These blessings would overflow Abraham to touch the lives of others. It's a demanding call. In order to accept this call, Abraham would have to leave his home and his family and travel to a place that he had never been. Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country, from your relatives, and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. In you all the families of earth will be blessed. Homeland, country. God chose a land for the Hebrews, and the Hebrews for the land. From the river Euphrates in the southwest. Nationhood. Different from race. A race doesn't have a law. A nation has laws. A theocratic nation, ruled by God, governed by God. Theocracy. Abram will be a blessing, of all mankind will be blessed through him. Abraham's name would be great, no doubt of this. 188 times in the Quran, 3 times called the friend of God. Protection. The chosen are precious, Zechariah says. Universal blessing. God will keep his promises at all costs. We see Abraham from the beginning of the promises to God everywhere. Since we are Christ, then we are also Abraham's seed, heirs according to promise. The blessings and conditions. I will make you a great nation. I will make your name great. I will give you this land. In you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. The conditions. Get out of your country. Go from your family, your kindred, from your father's house, your father's home, because Abraham obeyed my voice. He had to obey the voice of God. Genesis 28:15, I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. The blessings. Then God blessed them. In chapter 9, God blessed Noah. I will bless you, 12. 13, descendants can't be numbered. So shall descendants be. To your descendants I have given. I will make you fruitful. All the nations shall be blessed. All the nations shall be blessed. Abram was not only to be a blessing, but he was to be a blessing to others. I'll make you a great nation. I will make your name great. Bless those who bless you. Curse those who curse you. By you bless all the families of the earth. Give this land to your descendants. To your descendants shall be this as stars. To your descendants I will give this land. He repeats the promise and circumcision. Abraham was not only to be blessed, but he was going to be a blessing to others in all these situations. Abraham has become a great nation, a great name. In Abraham should all nations be blessed. At Shechem, Abraham was to have children who would inherit the land. At Bethel, Abraham is seed to inherit Canaan. Palestine is seed to be multitudinous. At Hebron, God makes a covenant by sacrifice. The boundaries of the land are defined. At Mount Moriah, Abraham to possess the gates of his enemies. In his seed all nations will be blessed. The promise is confirmed by an oath. We need to identify the various aspects of the promise and understand their fulfillment in the light of time. The 3 main parts of the promise. Abraham would become a great nation, inherit the land. Abraham's name would be great, would receive providential care, and all mankind would be blessed through Abraham's seed. God made a promise to Abraham that he would eventually affect the whole of human race. The history of Israel, Jacob and his descendants, is the unfolding of these promises. This promise began to be fulfilled soon after it was made. This promise was renewed with David. This promise found its ultimate fulfillment in Christ. We need to understand God's promises to Abraham and significance in its twofold nature. They were both physical and spiritual. Dr. John F. Valvoort, one of the leading premillennial theologians of the 20th century, observed of this 3-point promise. He said it recognized by all serious students of the Bible that the covenant of God with Abraham is one of the most determinative revelations of Scripture, he said. It furnishes a key to the entire Old Testament and reaches for fulfillment into the New Testament. In the controversy between premillennialism and amillennialism, the interpretation of this covenant more or less settles the entire argument. The analysis of its provisions and the character of their fulfillment set the mold for the entire body of scriptural truth. Here's a comparison chart on the millennial teaching, the post-millennial premillennialism, the pre-tribulation or dispensational premillennialism, and post-millennialism itself, and an amillennialism. The question is, how were God's promises to Abraham fulfilled? Our understanding of the nature and fulfillment of the divine plan of salvation depends upon the answer. You can check out all these in more detail under the topical Bible studies, God and His Kingdom, the Church and the Kingdom, and Jesus is King. Abraham receives a promise. After Lot left Abraham, the Lord again spoke to Abraham, this time between Bethel and Ai, and encouraged him by repeating the nation and land promises. Still later, when Abram was concerned because he didn't have a son to be his heir, the Lord again repeated to him the nation and the land promises. When Abram asked for assurance, the Lord turned the promise into a covenant, a legal agreement with Abraham. God told him it would be 400 years before his descendants inherited the land, and specified the extent of the land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord once more revealed himself to him. He renewed the covenant with Abram by changing his name to Abraham in Genesis 17. God promised Abraham, and this would be an everlasting covenant. The Lord expanded the nation promise by revealing to Abraham that both nations and kings would come from him. He also specified the land of Canaan would belong to Abraham's descendants as an everlasting possession. That everlasting will be expanded on later, but the idea is as long as it needed. At this time, the Lord God also changed the name of Sarah, Abraham's wife, to Sarah, and promised that she, though barren, would have a son, whom Abraham was to name Isaac, laughter, who would be the heir through whom the promises would be fulfilled. When Abraham was 100 and Sarah 90, Isaac, the child of promise, was born. When Isaac was a lad old enough to carry the wood for a sacrifice up Mount Moriah, the Lord God tested Abraham. God commanded Abraham to offer his darling son, the object of all his hope and the dearest thing on earth to him, as a burnt offering. The Lord demanded no more of Abraham than he himself later did for you and for me by giving his son upon the cross. When Abraham obeyed, the angel Lord stopped the aged, faithful patriarch just as he was poised to plunge a knife into the son of promise. Imagine waiting 100 years for a son and then being asked by God to kill him. And God added his oath by his own name, the highest name by which he could swear, to the promise and the covenant, and repeated the nation and seed promises. The threefold promise now has threefold divine assurance: the promise, the covenant, and the oath of the Lord, God who cannot lie. Many teachers call this promise to Abram unconditional, but there was nothing unconditional about it. Abraham had to leave his home and his family and go where the Lord would direct him. Walk before, live in recognition. He was in the presence of God and had to live his life as blameless as he possibly could. Be circumcised at the age of 99 and circumcise all the males of his house. That would be a cut for some people, a cut too far. Command his children and his household after him that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice. There's loads of conditions. Offer his beloved son of promise as a burnt offering. How would you like to have to keep all those conditions? And circumcision of all males as a sign of the covenant became a condition to all succeeding generations. Isaac. The Lord repeats all three promises to Isaac, but he conditioned their fulfillment on Isaac remaining in Canaan rather than going to Egypt. God also revealed he would fulfill the promises because Abraham obeyed my voice. He kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. Isaac obeyed the Lord as well. Jacob, the Lord selected Jacob as the son of Isaac, through whom the promise would be fulfilled, even before Jacob was born. As Jacob fled from his brother Esau, the Lord revealed himself at Bethel in a dream and gave to him all three of the divine promises. 20 years later, the Lord appeared to Jacob in Haran and commanded him to return to Canaan, promising he would deal well with him and make his descendants as the sand of the sea, which can be numbered for multitude. Jacob obeyed the Lord at risk of his life, both from his father-in-law Laban and brother Esau. Later, God commanded Jacob to go back to Bethel and build an ark to him, and Jacob obeyed. The Lord appeared to Jacob again, blessing him, changing his name to Israel. God prevails, or prince with God, and repeated to him the nation and land promises. When Israel was 130 years old, the Lord brought him and his family into Egypt, in fulfillment of the Lord's warning to Abraham. At the time Israel began his journey in Egypt, his family comprised of 75 to 76 people. 4 generations later, when that family left Egypt and were numbered by Moses in the wilderness, they could boast an army of 603,550 men, other than the tribe of Levi between the age of 20 and 60, able to go to war. That's just some population explosion. A generation later, as his people stood poised in the lands of Moab to cross Jordan into the land of promise, Moses taught them to say, when they brought the first fruits of the first harvest to the land to the priest, "My father was a Syrian, about to perish. He went out to Egypt and dwelt there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous," according to Deuteronomy 26. The first of the 3 great divine promises to Abraham had been fulfilled. In God's own time, in God's own way, the seed of Abraham had become a nation, great, mighty, populous. Meanwhile, back in chapter 12, notice 12:7, I will to your seed Zenith give this land, Canaan, to the nation Israel. Notice God made this covenant and promise. Abraham's question, 15:18, how shall I know that I will inherit the land? God's answer confirms the promise. It will be seen as fulfilled in Joshua 21 and 1 Kings 4 and all these other passages. Abraham's descendants will be sojourners and slaves in another land for 400 years. Doesn't mean to say that we're slaves the whole 400 years, meant part of that time will be sojourners and part of the time will be slaves. Abraham's descendants will return from Egyptian bondage to the promised land with great substance in the 4th generation. Note how God also vows to judge Egypt. Almighty shall rule in justice. Neither Abraham nor his descendants will take immediate possession of the land, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So God will come in judgment upon the people of Canaan when their sin just got totally out of control. The nation of Israel will be God's instrument in judging the wicked Amorites. God's covenant concluded in Genesis 15:17. In that day God made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land. And we see for the extent of the land, Genesis 15 for example, and these are passages. If you got something out of this passage, this study, please feel free to come back to us as we continue the idea of Abraham, the land, and seed promise. Every blessing.